Showdown is brewing in Rivers State. The State House of Assembly has announced it will probe the administration's expenditure during the recent 6-month emergency rule. The investigation will focus on how over 250 billion naira received from federal allocations was spent by the former sole administrator Vice Admiral Ibas. The administrator was appointed by President Tinubu after the elected governor was suspended. Now, civil society groups are supporting the probe, alleging a lack of transparency and stalled projects despite the large inflows of cash. However, the former administrator has dismissed the probe, stating the assembly did not appoint him and has no power to investigate his tenure. Well, lawyer and policy analyst Ibas joins us now to discuss the legality or otherwise of Rivers State Assembly's decision to probe the tenure of the sole administrator Ibas, whose tenure just ended Ibas on the 18th of September. At the expiration of the 6-month emergency rule. Now, this entire situation is interesting because, on one hand, a lot of people would say, what was the big deal in a probe, right? Nothing to hide, nothing to fear, right? But what we are seeing is a situation where it is about the constitutionality, but no one is talking about accountability here. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, while it is good, you can say, if you look at the Constitution section 120, 120, 121, and 122, empowers the State House of Assembly, to look into the finances and make laws for the finances of the state. The big question is, this also gives us an opportunity why the Supreme Court really needs to determine the proprietary or otherwise of the application of Section 305 of the Constitution, whether the president has powers to vacate a democratically elected government at the state level when a state of emergency is declared. Because there's a bit of quagmire here. Because by virtue of Section 11, subsection 4, when the House of Assembly is unable to sit, the National Assembly makes laws for that state. And so some persons have argued, even though I disagree, that by virtue of Section 305, the president has powers to vacate the democratic structures in the state. So in that vein, it is the president that was actually governing Rivers State through a proxy, an administrator. So the question now would be, by virtue of Section 120, 121, and 122, if the State House of Assembly has power to look into the finance, but do they have powers to look into, to probe the president? It would have been more appropriate for the the National Assembly that actually passed that budget by virtue of Section 11, subsection 4, to ask this administrator just few days before his exit to come give account of the expenses. But in the absence of that, if the State House of Assembly now, they can't invite the administrator because it's like summoning the president to appear before them. And so if they probe the revenue and expenses and look into it, which is necessary, which ordinarily would be good, to what end? When you're done, considering the romance also between them and the presidency, what will come out of it? I think, while it is, I see this as a way of appealing to the public, I also think that the crisis in Rivers are not yet over. Because from looking into the 6 months administration, what's the guarantee that they will not extend it into looking into the 2 years administration of Fubara when they were not, in the assembly? That time they were playing this ping pong of they are not members, or they are members. What's the guarantee that that's actually not where they are going to? And then you now say, let's start from this 6 months. Because you remember that assembly, it was 4 members that passed the first budget, 3 members passed the second budget. So all of this is still brewing. But if you look at it, while it is good constitutionally to say, yes, the House of Assembly has the powers to look at revenues of the state.
Yes.
But these revenues, were they spent under normal circumstances or under an emergency situation? And if they are spent under an emergency situation where the president was in charge, do they have the power to actually ask the president to account? And that's where the Supreme Court needs to come in.
But now you see, this is why, the Constitution for the longest time has been criticized for just being too vague. too vague, because we are just making our own interpretations. The same constitution in section 128 actually does give them the right to do what they are doing, giving the State House of Assembly the right to basically look into how affairs are carried out and scrutinize these issues. So they have a right to do what they're doing. But now the contention here is the gap within what they're trying to probe. There was a state of emergency that was put in place by virtue of Section 305, like you said, by the president. And 11 subsection 4 further gives them, the liberty to go about what they were doing. But on the basis of that, the National Assembly is the person that probes what was going on during the emergency role. But now the bone of contention here is still the accountability. I think for the people of Rivers State, whoever does the probing is not the issue. The question is, will the probe happen? If it's not going to be through the State House of Assembly, it has to be through a federal body. Is any federal body going to take up this probe? Because I don't think the issue is about whether or not the probe is by the national states or the national.
The people of Rivers State are not asking for just probe. They want heads to roll. If money is misappropriated,
of course,
will somebody go to jail for misappropriating the money? If at the end of the day, it will end as a jamboree and end up as a witch hunt, what would be the essence? And that's why I consistently say the matter at the Supreme Court should not end up as an academic exercise. Because if the House of Assembly consistently, if the democratic institutions were sitting, and then you had a state of emergency to clear out the insecurity in those areas, there won't be need for us to be arguing who is in charge or who spent the money. Because the House of Assembly would have budgeted money for that state of emergency, and then those monies would have been retired back to them, and then they have the powers to look at how it was spent. In this case, the same law provides power, gave the, the House of Assembly. If you remember, during the local government election, what was the position of the administrator? He said some certain portions of the constitution has been suspended. The applications of those laws has been suspended as regards Rivers State. And that was why they did what they did. And so in this case, if the administrator claims or says that, look, during this period, the State House of Assembly powers were suspended, and that so now he is answerable to the National Assembly that drew up the budget, that passed the budget. And because the president is answerable to the National Assembly. And at the end of the day, you conduct this investigation and you point accusing fingers and nothing comes out of it. Just the same way, the same administrator did also mention, do you remember the crisis of the CCTV cameras?
Yes.
And how money had been consistently budgeted for CCTV cameras every year. And at the end of the day, there were no CCTV cameras. So in this same case, so what's the guarantee that this this probe will not lead to that? And then you now say, okay, let us look at the budget of Fubara. Let us look at the further budget of 2023.
If there's one thing I can assure you of, it's that there's nothing that is above and beyond from happening within our political space, right? But I think that what we're also looking at is a wild goose chase here. Because the issue here began from a precedent that was set by enforcing Section 305 as the power to remove a democratically elected governor from his position, which also has now set a precedent that we do not have the capacity or structure
to manage.
So what do we foresee? Because whatever happens now sets a precedent for the future. So this is a clear case, alleged misappropriation of funds. What happens now?
So because over here, there are no consequences for actions or inaction. There should be consequences for every action or inaction. But who is the proper persons to melt out those consequences? So do these people who are probing now, do they have the capacity to sanction? The answer is no, they don't have the capacity to sanction. So at the end of the day, you appeal to emotions, you appeal to sentiment, and then the report will gather dust. And so why don't we, for me, that's where the courts, it should be like yesterday. Let the Supreme Court determine, does the president have powers to sack a democratic elected government while a state of emergency is declared? If the president does not have that power, then all of these issues of making laws that the House of Assembly is unable to sit, and so because of that, the National Assembly is making law for them, considering the subsection 4 of section 305 also, that says that the governor can even invite a president to declare state of emergency. Does that mean that the governor can invite the president to sack him from office? The answer is no. So that is why we're in this quagmire.
That's what the word is.
So to avoid all of this quagmire, I think the best thing for them, because also they're in bed with the same presidency, the best thing for them is to look at the probe, look at how, let me not even use the word probe, look at how finances were appropriated and managed, and then let people know. And then you can now send the report to the National Assembly that's...
But let me, we have to wrap this up, but I just even want to ask a question, right? This finances, Shebi, I apologize for using such regular parlance, but
no, it's allowed,
is it not
okay.
Nigerians? Is it not the people of River State that this money was used on? Why is it almost such an issue to let the people know this is how this money was spent for accountability?
I would have expected that ordinarily, as the administrator is leaving office, he would do a handover note. The handover note was, this was what we received, and this is how it was.
We used it.
We used what was received. And then the governor, ordinarily, the governor should now be the one to say, look, I'm not comfortable with the way this handover note is. Then you now make a request to the State House of Assembly to say, invite the necessary parties to come do further explanation on how this money was spent. And that's, for me, I'm being a bit skeptical on the motive behind this move by the House of Assembly. Right? Because your first day of sitting, you're asking the governor to send names of commissioner. Even the governor have not even resumed. And then the next thing you're saying, you want to probe what happened in the last 6 months, the finances. I think it is a bit too premature to begin to discuss, because it will appeal to sentiment. It will appeal to the people. But technically speaking, the way it is going, I doubt if anything will come out of it.
Liberal Shoma, it's always a joy listening to your analysis on these issues, because it's a further reminder for Nigerians that we do have laws, we do have systems, but what is lacking therein is the implementation of the tools.
Because the law is what the court says it is.
It is.
No matter how confusing the law is, it is for the court to set it right and say, this is the way it is.
You're
But the absence
correct.
of that, then we're having all of these challenges.
We have all of these issues. Chaos, that's the word. Well, thank you so much, Roberto Shoma, for your time.